Pull up a chair, folks, and gather round the fire, because what I'm about to tell you really happened. Or, at least, that's what they say. It all began many years ago in a small town called Blackwood Creek, nestled deep within the North Carolina forests. There was an old sawmill there. Not just old, but ancient. It had stood there longer than anyone could remember, its blackened timbers creaking in the winds as if whispering long-forgotten secrets. The sawmill belonged to the McCallum family. They had worked there for generations, each one as stubborn and sturdy as the oaks they felled. But even the McCallums knew there was something not quite right about the place. Workers often spoke of strange sounds coming from the depths of the forest after dark, creaks that shouldn't be there, and whispers that seemed to call their names. One particularly harsh year, when the rains hadn't stopped for weeks and the fog clung to the ground like a shroud, the sawmill suddenly ground to a halt. The main saw, a huge, heavy one they called the tree eater, was jammed. No one could budge it. Old Jed McCallum, the head of the family, was furious. Without the saw, there was no work, and without work, there was no money. He gathered all his men and declared, "We'll get it running no matter the cost, even if we have to dismantle it log by log." The youngest of the workers was a lad named Thomas. He was new, just arrived from the city, and his heart hadn't yet hardened from the toil and harsh tales. Thomas was enthusiastic, but also a little scared. He'd heard the old lumberjack stories, and one particular tale bothered him, about the sawmill's first owner, who was rumored to have gone mad and disappeared into the forest, leaving behind only a note with the single word, "It breathes." The next day, Jed and his crew began to dismantle the tree eater. It was a titanic job. The fog was so thick you could only see a few feet in front of you. The air was heavy and damp, smelling of earth and decaying wood. As they reached the heart of the mechanism, they discovered something strange. Among the gears and chains, where there should have been only grease and metal, they found fibers. Long black fibers like roots entwined around the moving parts. No one knew what it was. They tried to pull them out, but the fibers were tough and tenacious, as if alive. As they pulled, it seemed as if a quiet but persistent whisper came from deep within the machine, raising the hairs on the back of their necks. Thomas, who was standing a little to the side, felt a shiver run down his spine. He remembered the story of the tree eater, which was rumored to have been built on the site of an ancient Indian burial ground. Locals had always avoided the place, considering it cursed. One of the workers, old Harry, who had worked at the sawmill his entire life, suddenly cried out. He was holding his hand, from which one of the black fibers protruded. It had pierced directly into his skin, and instead of blood, some black, viscous liquid oozed from the wound. Harry staggered. His eyes glazed over, and he began to mumble something. The words were unintelligible, but Thomas thought he heard something about darkness and hunger. Jed, who was a stern man but not without compassion, immediately took Harry home. He ordered the others to continue working, but Thomas saw a shadow of worry even on Jed's face. They worked late into the night, by the light of kerosene lamps that cast eerie shadows throughout the building. The more fibers they pulled out, the louder the whispers became. Now it wasn't just a whisper, but a cacophony of voices, intertwining with each other like countless trapped souls. Thomas began to feel these voices penetrating his mind, trying to say something, but the words were too fast and distorted. By midnight, they had almost cleared the tree-eater. Only a few fibers remained, which seemed to be the thickest and most tenacious. When one of the workers tried to pull out a particularly stubborn fiber, it twitched, and the entire sawmill shuddered. From deep within the earth, a low, guttural growl seemed to emanate. At that moment, the fog outside grew even thicker, and Thomas felt the air around them grow colder. He looked up and saw outlines in the sawmill windows, which had always been covered in dirt and dust. Outlines of faces, vague, blurry, but faces that seemed to be watching them from the darkness. His heart pounded wildly. He tried to cry out, to warn the others, but his voice caught in his throat. The workers, engrossed in their task, noticed nothing. The whispers grew louder, now not just in his head, but seemingly emanating from the very walls of the sawmill. Suddenly, Jed returned. His face was as pale as a sheet, and his eyes wide with terror. "Harry, he's changed," he whispered. "He's sitting there, in his house, staring at the wall. He keeps saying only one word, over and over. It breathes, it breathes." At the very moment Jed uttered those words, the last thick fiber was torn from the tree-eater. And then a scream erupted. It wasn't a human scream, but something older, deeper, a cry that pierced bones and made the earth tremble. The sawmill walls cracked. The wooden beams that supported the roof began to buckle. Shadows crawled out from cracks in the floor, long and writhing like snakes. The air filled with the smell of damp earth and decay, and in it something felt alive. "Run!" Jed screamed, and this time his voice was full of panic. "Run, for God's sake!" The workers rushed towards the exit, but the doors, which had been open moments before, now slammed shut with a deafening bang. It was as if the sawmill itself had closed its jaws, determined not to let its prey escape. Thomas, consumed by horror, fell to his knees. He watched as the shadows coalesced, taking form. They resembled people, but their limbs were too long, their movements unnatural. Their eyes glowed with a faint red light. The creatures of shadow seemed to move silently, yet each of their steps echoed directly in Thomas's head, amplifying the cacophony of whispers. Workers scrambled around the sawmill, trying to find an exit, but all doors and windows were tightly locked or boarded up from the inside. Some of them began to scream, but their cries quickly turned into gurgling sounds as the shadows overtook him. Thomas, paralyzed by fear, closed his eyes. He heard wood creaking and breaking, metal grinding, and the voices in his head becoming increasingly clear. They spoke of the earth, of ancient roots, of what was here before humans, and what would come after. They spoke of hunger. When he opened his eyes again, he saw Jed McCallum. The old lumberjack, who had always seemed so unyielding, now stood staring into emptiness, his face distorted by a grimace of terror and resignation. From his chest protruded the very same black fibers they had been pulling from the saw. They pulsed with a faint, sinister light, as if filling him with something alien.
Subscribe to channel